All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 6th season of Mary Talks. My name is Jeremy Vaughn. I am the Associate Director of Alumni Programs and Director of Arts Advancement here at Mary Washington, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We are excited to host a sizable audience for tonight's presentation, which includes over 300 alumni, students, parents, and friends from across the country and beyond, including Agnières-sur-Seine, France. As with past lectures, there will be time after tonight's presentation for our guests to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to ask a question by clicking on the Q&A icon below and submitting there, or vote for other submitted questions to help them rise to the top of the list. At this time, I'd like to introduce Jess Kirby, class of 2023, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Jess, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good evening, everyone. Professor Sushma Subramanian is an assistant professor of journalism here at the University of Mary Washington. She's the author of How to Feel, The Science and Meaning of Touch, an exploration of our most mysterious sense. Professor Subramanian is a science and health journalist whose writing has appeared in Slate, The Atlantic, Elle, Scientific American, Discover, and many others. She has twice been a finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists and was a winner of the Newswomen's Club of New York Front Page Award. She has received research support from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, and the Genetics and Behavior Journalism Fellowships. Subramanian also advises the student newspaper, the Blue and Gray Press. She has been my professor, advisor, and mentor every semester that I've been at UMW. It is now my honor to present tonight's guest as she presents How to Feel, The Science and Meaning of Touch. Professor, the floor is yours, and welcome to Mary Talks.
Thanks so much, Jess. And thanks everyone for coming to hear me talk about what I've learned about the sense of touch doing this book. It's a real honor to be invited to do this. So I started to write my book because I'm a science writer and I really didn't see any other book out there that could explain how this mysterious sense works and what it means culturally. But I really could never have predicted that it would come out in the midst of a global pandemic when we all started to think about the sense of touch a lot more. So that's where I want to start today. I think the pandemic has made a lot of us consider our reliance and perhaps over-reliance on screens. I've heard a lot of discussion about whether hugs and handshakes will ever come back. There are a lot of people talking about loneliness and skin hunger, especially in people who live alone. And ultimately, people are wondering whether we'll ever go back to touching the way that we used to. We, of course, don't know yet how what we're experiencing will affect the world's cultures in the long term, and whether this time could make us appreciate touch more. To be honest, I'm guessing probably not, but I do think it's worth exploring that question more to at least understand the urge to have it answered. And maybe there's some kind of nostalgia for a more communal life that we're yearning for. Maybe we have a deep need for touch that we don't feel like we're fully reckoning with. But before talking to you about our tactile future, I actually want to share with you 5 interesting facts about touch. And I'm hoping that by going through this set of facts, we'll be able to better answer the bigger questions in an informed way. And if not that, then at least to reframe them so we're asking better questions, and also to consider more deeply what we actually want in terms of touch, socially and culturally in the future. Is it really about going back to past touchier times? And just to give you a little tidbit before we get started with my little list, I will say that we've been seeing a long decline in touch for a long time, centuries now, way before this pandemic. So people are experiencing real fears currently about how touch averse the culture has gotten. But I think it's more useful to think about our present moment as being on a continuum. So let me pull up my presentation. So I want to start with a basic, which is that not everyone agrees what touch even is. Scientists can't agree on this. And we know a lot less about touch than we do about the other senses. That's partially because for a long time, it wasn't considered that important a sense to study, but also it's a sense that can't be isolated to a single body part. It's not like vision where you're clearly studying the eye, right? So basically, scientists decide how to define it based on the way they're studying it. And so if they're studying certain nerves, that's how one group might define it. It might have to do for others with a certain part of the brain that processes this information. For others, it might be certain types of sensation that they consider to be touch, like some don't consider pain and itch to be parts of our sense of touch. So of course, the way that we understand touch, most of us, is not scientific, it's cultural. And we also get this idea from Greek philosophers who described the five senses as they understood them intuitively. And it seems obvious to us that temperature and itch and pain and pressure, all of these are parts of touch and help create our perceptions of our bodies coming up against the environment. But because we know touch intuitively, that often means that when we're really asked to define it, we can't really say what it is. And that was my experience when I first started my research. I couldn't really define touch for myself. So that's something that I set out to do. Really quickly, this is just a homunculus, which is a representation of the body in the brain. And this is meant to illustrate like the size of the representation in the brain of different body parts. So of course, our lips and our hands are more sensitive than other parts of my body, of the body, sorry. But through my research, I came to understand that what I know, and probably what most of us understand, is our sense of touch is really about kind of a bigger haptic sense. And haptic sensation is made up of three elements. There's the sensation that we experience on our skin, which some would refer to as touch. Then there's movement, because without our skin actually moving against objects, we wouldn't experience touch. And then there's this deeper knowledge of where our body is in space, and that's called proprioception. And when any of those isn't working, then the ability to touch is impaired. This is just an image of proprioception at work. If we didn't have proprioception, we wouldn't be able to know to touch our nose with our eyes closed. So touch is, in summary, really complicated, and having a sense of touch is really about a total feeling of embodiment. And there's even like more we can go into here, because of course, touch is so connected to our emotions, like pain. It's impossible to feel it without an emotional reaction unless you have, a certain kind of disorder. But that takes us in a totally different direction. Briefly, I just want to talk about one anecdote that I include in the book, which is a meeting that I had with a man named Waterman, who lost all touch and proprioception when he was in his late teens. And for him, it takes a crazy amount of effort to be able to make basic movements. He has to consciously think about every muscle he needs to tighten and every limb he needs to keep in balance. And he's just lost this ability to do this without focused effort, which is a form of intelligence that we have, and I think we don't often think about. All right, so the next fact about our sense of touch that I want to share is that our beliefs about touch shape how our world feels. So like, we're not just experiencing touch factually, all of our cultural beliefs about touch actually affects how we experience it. So I'm going to go back to the Greeks. Ever since Plato, touch has been an underappreciated sense. To Plato, it was higher thought that set humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. And vision, because it's the distance sense, as in we kind of look at things at a remove, he believed that it represented higher thought. Vision allows us to be reasonable and objective. So it was the highest sense in his hierarchy. And touch was the lowest. And that's because all animals, the belief is all animals have a basic bodily awareness, and it's just, concerned with things like basic survival, not complex reasoning, or anything like that. So, of course, Plato's beliefs about touch weren't so simple. He also contemplated the idea of the soul making contact with the divine through touch. But still, his basic hierarchy continued to be carried on through the ages. So, in fact, we're going to go to the Middle Ages next. And I want you to sort of think about the way life felt in the Middle Ages and compare that to, how life feels to us today. Life was literally rougher. A worker would get up in the morning and put on some scratchy clothes and go out into the cold and do physical labor. And of course, whether you felt this depended on where you stood in the class system, but even people who are considered very high class, knights, were valued for their physical prowess. And of course, they didn't have such a comfortable environment either. So people's value really came from the mastery of their bodies and braving harsh conditions. So then imagine this person in the Middle Ages returning home at night and then being surrounded by family near a hearth. That idea of being surrounded by loved ones and feeling warm, this was not just metaphorical, it was literal. People ate with their hands out of shared bowls, they slept in familial beds, they had communal baths. So the textures of life, of course, completely changed people's mindsets. So it was a world with a wide range of feelings, and it was one where both violence and extreme closeness were more tolerated. And it was also a world in which group cohesion was really important, more so than personal space, probably just for safety reasons. And so even spirituality was more sensual. People felt connected to the divine through touching relics and even placing them in their mouths. Saints practiced a healing touch. Practices such as the laying of the hands were more common. And we've slowly moved in the direction of a culture that is much more visual than tactual. So I want to sort of do a compare and contrast. So today, it's work that is intellectual that gets valued the most. So if you're doing physical labor, you typically make less money. Personal space is considered very important to us and a sign of politeness and perhaps sophistication. And that's often at the expense of a lot of interpersonal touch and maybe even a sense of community. And it's very easy for us to avoid interacting with people in person and do it through screens instead, which makes us, it prevents us from having some of that friction that I think was part of daily life in the Middle Ages. And those who pray do so, I think, mostly by like using mental images in their, and they imagine things in their minds. And of course, violence isn't as accepted. Corporal punishment has fallen out of favor. So our tactile lives have changed in a lot of ways. And we can kind of trace this a long ways back to a cultural valuing of vision over touch. Now, it's not that we've done this consciously. It's about beliefs that we've held for a long time that we perhaps have gone they've gone undetected. But it's telling that today we surround ourselves with screens and we touch a lot less. All right, so my next fact about the sense of touch is that touch and vision compete with each other. So the highest and the lowest sense, there are ways they cooperate and also fail to cooperate. So of the traditional five senses, touch and vision are really the most important to creating our sense of embodiment, or the sense of ourselves. So think about how we become aware of our existence separate from what's around us. It's usually because the sense of touch and the sense of vision are aligned. So like when we jump up, we observe our eyes, or we observe the scenery kind of going up and down. And we also feel our body moving. And so touch and vision confirm each other's realities. And then also we see this cooperation in people who have disabilities. When we lose vision, we use touch to replace it. For those rare people like Ian Waterman, who I mentioned earlier, who they lose touch, then they actually replace that by using vision to be able to know where their body is in space instead. And so usually touch and vision are on the same page, but there are times when they're not. So think about virtual reality when they're telling different stories. The brain is in a very uncomfortable position and tries to create a cohesive message for us about how to perceive our world by deciding which sense to believe. And in this competition, our eyes usually win and touch gets silence. And the reasons are biological. Our tendency to believe what we see is largely just because vision accounts for more of our brain's computing power than touch. The visual cortex takes up 30% about, and touch is more like 8%, although that's imperfect because that doesn't include proprioception. But the brain also has regular practice quieting down the feelings of touch and movement in our bodies. And for example, like if you put on a shirt, you feel it when you first put it on, but you don't feel it afterwards. And the reason is because, we want to focus on new stimuli, right? Things that could pose us real harm. And so it doesn't make sense to be hyper aware of touch all the time. But that's why we tend to let it fade into the background. Now, this relates to fears that we have about our modern world. Let's think about an activity that that most of us might consider one of our favorites, which is staring at our phones. And focusing on the bright screens really does make us block out other parts of our existence. And it's something that we internally notice, but don't do very much about. So some of our literature tells us a lot about the touch vision competition that gets enacted when we do this. In articles that I found about digital detoxing, a constant theme is that once the writers put away their devices without the constant flashes of light calling for their attention, they become calmer, they regain other sensations, and it's mostly touch that they've been suppressing. So they dance, they make crafts, or they simply walk, and that makes them pay more attention to inner needs that have gone unrecognized and unmet. So in other words, looking at screens actually makes us, to some extent, dissociate from our bodies. Though we think of ourselves as firm and solid, our mental representations of ourselves are always in flux, depending on our sensory surroundings. And especially when we over-focus on touch at the expense, over-focus on vision at the expense of touch. All right, so the next point I think is pretty obvious to most people, but I think it's important to state anyway, which is that gentle, caring touch is good for our health. And there's a cascade of chemicals that make touch so important to wellness. A welcome touch, and it's really important that welcome touch is shown to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, which then sets off the release of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, hormones that contribute to overall happiness. And prolonged deep touch, like what you get from a massage, can reduce aggressive behavior and lower the body's fight or flight response. It can also curb inflammation and increase the body's count of white blood cells, which play an important role in defending our bodies against disease. You might have heard about the term skin hunger to describe problems that occur when people report being out of regular touch. People who say that they experience a dearth of physical affection also say they experience more loneliness, depression, and mood and anxiety disorders. They had more immune disorders, and also they're more prone to having alexithymia, which impairs the ability to recognize what their emotions are, which makes it harder to develop close relationships, and of course then receive more touch. And then on a less scientific level, touch helps kind of bring us into ourselves. When we experience touch, what it does is allow us to experience more of the internal sensations that we have in our bodies. So like hunger, bodily pain, what our emotions are telling us. We just have more information at our disposal. So this is, for instance, why massage has been shown to be useful to anorexia patients, because how they start to focus more on how they feel in their bodies. And that includes their hunger cues, instead of reacting on a more surface level, or focusing on what appearances might be. Now, depending on who we are, we get touched more or less, and we're kind of programmed differently to respond to touch in different ways. As children, of course, we get more touch than at any other time in our lives, hopefully. But beyond that, it's generally more acceptable for women to touch each other than it is men. Men are socialized to avoid touching each other, except in the context of sports. And that means that it's unlikely for a lot of men to receive touch if they're not in romantic relationships. And of course, fewer of us are getting married or pairing up. So there's less of a chance of that happening for some people. And also people who are marginalized because of race, income, disability, or any of number of reasons, they also might experience less touch. So we have a very stratified society when it comes to touch, and it's become a scarce resource, and one that we have all different types of associations with that are associated with this programming, but it's also really important to our health, right? So it's just a conflicted relationship that we have with touch. All right, so the last fact that I want to share about touch is that we use commodities to replace regular touch in our lives. And I think that part of the reason that we do this is to help us deal with some of these inequalities that I was talking about. We can buy super expensive sheets and really fancy massage chairs to soothe us. We have weighted blankets, and I personally love my weighted blanket, and fidget spinners, and relaxation balls, and all kinds of diversions to soothe ourselves. And soon we might have robotic pets that we play with as if they're the real thing. I actually have a friend who didn't want to take care of a real cat, but her son really wanted one, so she got him a robotic cat, and he absolutely adores it, and she doesn't have to do all of the work of taking care of an animal in the house. But I think and one of the most confounding things regarding the commodification of touch, I think that some people have heard about, is the professional cuddler. And this is someone who is kind of akin to a massage therapist, although it's not really massage. It's mostly somebody who you can pay to kind of hug you and lie down and spoon with you for a given period. It's not sexual, but there are a lot of different ways that if we're not receiving touch, we can purchase it. And I think that in regards to this trend, the wellness industry is a particular interesting thing to study, because the way that medicine used to work, it was a more tactile practice. So early medical practitioners, they believed that the sensations that we were exposed to really mattered to overall health. So like in ancient Greece, there were these 4 key tactile properties of the body: heat, cold, wetness, and dryness. And it was important for these to stay in balance to maintain health. And for doctors, touch was considered to be the most important instrument because it was a way to provide care. But then a sensory shift started happening around 16th and 17th centuries because of the influence of Protestantism. And medical care started to feel different. And it's also, it continues to feel less tactile today. But basically pleasurable treatments like baths or massage, or even eating sugar, which was once considered healthful because sugar is easy to digest, they fell out of favor. That's part because of not scientific knowledge, but also religious teachings said that sensory pleasures could have a corrupting quality. So treatments just became a lot less sensual in nature. And then later there were tools like thermometers and stethoscopes, and then scans that made it increasingly possible to kind of avoid touching patients, which is something that I think doctors and patients both desired, just because I think cultural changes that were happening. And also a doctor's book knowledge, which was symbolized by sight, replaced touch, or the idea of trained healing hands in medical practice. Nurses sort of replaced a doctor's sense of touch, because women have consistently been more associated with the sense of touch than men. But even then, I would say that, most of us, if we've been to a hospital, the nurses really only touch us in very perfunctory ways. But what that means is that we have to look outside of mainstream medicine to find healing. We have to sort of go back to ancient medical practices. And this is just sort of illustrate this hospital scene, to illustrate just how non-sensual our medical system is. But I think that looking to the wellness industry is an imperfect solution because it fails to acknowledge the kind of full-bodied experience that we're looking for when we want medical care. When we're weak and in pain, many people do want more touch. They want to feel comforted. And that's one reason why the replacement of touch with, in general healthcare is problematic. But most importantly, it's unequal because depending on who you are, you're more or less likely to get touch. And it's, all of this is based on cultural scripts about who deserves touch or who's allowed to have it. And I would argue that the more that we sideline touch from our regular existence in this way, the more we see our needs showing up in these trends, but it never really gets to the root issues. They're elaborate ways that we have of redeveloping our connection to our bodies that we might find missing in other interactions. But I think that, it's probably worthwhile to think more deeply about the sensory imbalance that we could be facing. So now I want to come back and just talk about those ideas that I started out with, which is, I sort of said, I don't think we will end up in a touchier world. And I also don't think that that's necessarily the goal. We have our individual needs for touch that are different, and we have different cultural expectations. And there's just so much variability that we can't expect others to act in the way we want anymore. So we can't just say, we want to go back to, a more huggier existence. And I think previously, we were all expected to be kind of subsumed into the dominant culture. We had to conform. And as much as people, they don't like this turn away from touch that we've had, it's had its benefits. People are able to more freely voice their discomfort with being touched in certain ways. And I'd argue that in a more touchy society, it can be very hard to speak up for people who don't want it. But I do think still that it's useful to explore where our beliefs about touch come from and whether we want to perpetuate them in our day-to-day practices. And for that, I think we want to embrace all of the feelings that we have about touch and let ourselves have them and communicate them better. And that really comes from, I think, developing different scripts about touch from a young age. So thinking about things like bodily autonomy and what feels good to you, and conversations about consent. And these are not things I learned. Instead, I was taught to just comply, look but don't touch. You have to go hug grandma. So from the beginning, we're not allowed to have our own feelings and act on those feelings. And I would say that if we are truly encouraged to touch the way we want to early on, then we might actually have a more touch-friendly future in several decades. I assume that most of us are adults here, though, so it's probably too late for us to change our past. But I do think that we have an opportunity to challenge our beliefs about touch still. As I just went over, a lot of them are cultural and technological, and ultimately have very little to do with what we actually want. And I actually personally came to this book as not a huge fan of touch. And I think it's fine for people who don't want touch to not have it. But I think in cases like mine, I had to look at my programming that was preventing me from enjoying touch. I actually attended massage school for a couple semesters, and the experience that I had there was just that for the first time, I was experiencing touch in a way that it was just factual. It was just fellow classmates and I exchanging roles on the massage table. And it really it helped me undo a lot of my thinking about touch that really were more about, fear of vulnerability and being open about my emotions, and, and also worries that other people wouldn't respect my boundaries and things like that. So it's really hard for each of us to do that kind of thing in today's environment. I don't think that most people would go to massage school to retrain their touch experiences. But I guess, you could ask a friend or a partner, but that also takes a certain comfort level that you would have to have already. And then, of course, we're all contending with screens, and so we have a tendency to use that as a crutch. But I do think that turning to a professional, a massage therapist, can be beneficial. And even more than that, it's just about being conscious of where our touch behaviors come from, and starting small with, taking on a hobby that involves using your hands, or getting a massage ball and notice the sensations that you feel within yourself. And I guess, finally, I think it's important to ask, why is this even important? Why do we have to fix this sensory imbalance? And the way that I think about it, touch helps us to get in tune with our inner being. So joy, compassion, pain, and not just surface emotions. And the more we really allow ourselves to feel what we feel, I think the more we can be present for others in the same way. So it can be a real exercise in empathy. So yeah, those are my feelings about touch in the past and in the future. Thanks for listening.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a few questions that I'd like to go through them here. The first one we have is, when you talk about touch with your students, do you find a difference in their experience with touch as compared to older adults?
Good question. You know, I don't talk to my students that much about touch. Although I do think that, you know, the other day we were talking about writing personal essays in my magazine journalism class, and I brought up my experience going to massage school because that was a personal experience that I brought to my book. And everybody knew about professional cuddlers, and I think that there wasn't the aversion to seeing a professional cuddler that I think an older person might have.
Interesting. The next question, would you say that our dependence on technology, use of smartphones, et cetera, has made it easier to disconnect from each other, and we are slowly losing our humanity and care towards one another?
Yeah, that's the general fear that people have. And that goes back to this like Ready Player One analogy, right? The more we live in the virtual world, the less we'll care about the one that we actually live in. And I think that we haven't gone that far, right? But that fear does linger because we are on this continuum. And I think we all do recognize that there is something that we lose when we put a barrier between us and other people through our phones. And we also, I think it's a barrier, not just against other people, but from ourselves, because when we're staring at our phone, we actually lose other kinds of bodily awareness. Like we blink less, we swallow less, we feel less in our bodies. When I was in a virtual environment, like I used a VR headset for the first time in this one science lab where they're studying chronic pain. And I did have the experience where it didn't take long for me to identify more with the avatar of myself than actual me in my body. And I was, kind of ducking around in this virtual environment, even though I could feel my actual body wasn't there and it was fine. So I do think there is something that, we lose sensation wise when we focus on vision.
Okay. This next question flows right into that topic. Do you see society returning to an emphasis on touch someday, or will this trend of it decreasing continue?
Yeah, and that I think that we certainly won't go back, I think, for a while to people hugging strangers and and shaking hands. And that's, I think, just people have more fears about that regarding health. But I think that just this trend has been going on for a long time, right? And so we have seen, what happens, I think, if we look at the whole timeline, is that we do use vision more, we use touch less over time. But then it pops up, like more touch might pop up in a trend, or, us doing more, yoga classes or things like that. So I think that if people have this need for touch, it is, showing up in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that leads even just as well into the next one. Did your research find anything related to touch and meditation? Can focusing on sensations like breath, clenching and relaxing muscles help to rebalance our sense of touch without being dependent on others?
Yeah, definitely. And that was actually seen as part of this way that that touch appears in kind of social trends that we experience. So like, things like arts and crafts movements and also yoga and meditation. A lot of this does come from this realization that perhaps during regular life we're not experiencing our bodies or not in tune with our bodies. And so I think people do turn to these practices to help themselves. So I think it's a really good way, if you're touch averse, if you don't want to touch other people, it's a good way privately to experience that reconnection to the body. But there's another aspect of that, which is just what that means culturally, because what we are essentially doing, I think a lot of these practices are Eastern practices, right? And we've always had this Western hierarchy that vision is higher than touch. So I think it's really interesting that we feel like we have to look at a culture outside of ours in order to gain this this rebalancing of the senses, but we don't really have to, right? That's a kind of a false belief.
And that leads again into the next question about looking at touch cross-culturally, that the belief that the history, perception, beliefs, and practices regarding touch in Asian cultures, Native American and indigenous cultures, and African and Middle Eastern. I mean, obviously, culturally, there are some differences there, but do you care to comment on any more of that, on how we view touch as compared to other areas of the world?
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of these cultures, we often look to them in terms of like our spa culture. Right? Our spa culture really it relies on a lot of Eastern practices, Native American practices, but I think that like one good general way that I saw of looking at touch practices is just that hotter cultures tend to touch more, and that might just be because they have more skin exposed, or maybe it's something about like the sun putting them in a better mood. I don't know. But then also that in collectivistic cultures, there can be less touching than in individualistic cultures, because there's less of a kind of performance in your personal relationships, and it's more about treating people equally. So that's what I kind of observed in my Indian culture, because I had to look at that. And like when I was younger, I would look at my parents and think it was interesting that I never really saw them touch each other. I never saw them hug or kiss, and I would go to friends' houses and see their parents doing that. So it was interesting to explore where that came from. But I do want to say that these are just generalizations, and of course, there's a lot of variety within these cultures.
Sure. Another question talks, it's more like a comment from someone who I think works in the medical field. Our hospital offers healing touch to patients in need, and it's amazing how the power of touch, when used properly, can help ease patients' pain and anxiety. My teacher reminded me once when learning healing touch that most times when we are injured, our hands go straight to the place of the pain. Interesting. I like that. Another one, completely different angle, touching in professional environments can be intrusive. When attending meetings, the expectation is that everyone that has met before will hug. That's a pre-COVID idea. This can seem insincere and exclusive of new attendees. Okay. Let me see. I think the last question I have here is, could reconnecting with the sense of touch also help us reconnect with aspects of nature and become more aware or active in environmental issues?
Yeah, this is interesting because if we compare, like we live in a temperature controlled world, and we are indoors really not feeling much. Like when I started to compare what our world feels like compared to maybe the way it did historically, I was just thinking about how boring it is, right? We don't feel the patterns of nature in the same way. And so we don't feel impacted by them either, because we can kind of lock ourselves away. So I do think that forcing ourselves to go out and experience the environment more, really feeling it, could aid in environmental efforts.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Professor and Jess, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks again to all of our viewers at home for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel starting tomorrow. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of Mary Talks. Our sixth season of Mary Talks continues on Wednesday, October 13th, with a special presentation. Associate Vice President and Dean of Student Life, Cedric Rucker, will give a special presentation on his time at Mary Washington entitled From an Uncertain Start to Engaging Adventure. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you and good night. Thanks, everyone.